That day was one of the most legendary moments in NBA history. Everyone was frozen in place until Michael Jordan looked Jimmy Butler straight in the eyes and said, "You don't belong here." But Jimmy's response to Michael didn't just silence the crowd, it silenced the entire league. Take a second to find out what Jimmy's response was. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is and where you're from. Let's go. It was a little past 3:20 p.m. The location, the NBA headquarters, in a special hall where the Basketball Legends Summit was being held. Michael Jordan was at the head of the table. Next to him were former stars, league executives on one side and active players on the other. Of course, the cameras were rolling, but no one was putting on a show. The topic of the meeting was quite clear, but it was not a simple one, of course. Providing infrastructure support for young players, strengthening sports culture in poor neighborhoods, and equal opportunities for new talent. Everyone was seated. LeBron James was sitting quietly a few seats away. Next to him were some of the NBA's young representatives. Jimmy Butler was sitting on the left side of the table. He had been deliberately placed there. It was actually a strategic position, because some in the league wanted to hear what he had to say, while others wanted to corner him. For the first 20 minutes of the meeting, Jimmy listened without saying a word. The speakers talked about general topics. Files were opened and closed. Words like community service projects and volunteering were flying around, but Jimmy was waiting. Finally, his chance had come. When Michael Jordan said, "We need to give authority to local coaches and communities," Jimmy put his hands on the table, leaned forward, and began to speak. "With all due respect, this is not a matter of local control. This is a matter of some kids being forced to give up basketball before they even learn to write their names." At that moment, there was a slight stir in the room. Some people looked up suddenly, and some stopped taking notes. Jimmy continued, "Last year I visited 17 gyms in Liberty Heights. Most of them had broken hoops, no balls, and cracked floors in several places. How are these kids supposed to dream of the NBA?" Michael Jordan initially lowered his head, then flipped through all the pages in his file. But he didn't want to say anything. A moment later, he slowly raised his head and locked his eyes on Jimmy's. And then he uttered the words no one expected him to say. "You don't belong on this court." A cold, silent atmosphere spread throughout the gym. No one expected to hear those words from Jordan's mouth at that moment, with the cameras rolling. Jimmy didn't even care. His expression didn't change. But the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. It was as if the walls had suddenly narrowed, as if everyone, even the most experienced stars, had held their breath. Jimmy didn't answer right away. First, 3 seconds passed, then 6. Then, he slowly placed his hands on his knees and tapped his fingers lightly twice, because that was his own internal signal. "Now it's time to talk." First, he raised his head. Then he began to speak without looking away. "I was drafted 30th. No one thought I would last 5 years. But I didn't just stay. I carried teams. I made it to the finals. And I did it for the kids who started playing basketball under a broken hoop in Harlem." He continued with an example. "I belong on this court because the kids who brought me here are still there. And I'm going to stay here until all those kids, no matter what neighborhood they live in, have a basketball, a coach, and a dream." There was no sound, but now it was a different kind of silence. Jordan stared at Jimmy without blinking. Then he leaned back slightly, covered his lips with his hands, and whispered something to his advisor sitting next to me. But he got no response. Something had changed at the table. Senator Bradley Thompson lowered his gaze. Then he bowed his head slightly toward Jimmy. Nina Howard, sitting next to Jimmy, closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. Hank Morrison even turned his head with a small smile. That arrogant look had been broken for the first time. And Jimmy, he didn't take his eyes off Michael Jordan for a second. Jimmy Butler was not only looking at Michael Jordan, but also at his own past. In that silence, with everyone in the room frozen, Jimmy's mind had traveled back to the dusty streets of Liberty Heights years ago. To the days when his mother left home and his father was nowhere to be found. He was on his way to the lawlessness that life had taught him at a young age. Because basketball was no longer just a sport to him. It was also a way for him to survive in this life. When he was 10 years old, he started staying at a friend's house in the suburbs of Miami. Every day was a different house, a different couch, and a different way of filling his stomach. But every morning, he woke up to the same routine: go to school, then play basketball on the open court, waiting to see if someone with a ball would come. Sometimes in the rain, sometimes in the sun, and most of the time on an empty stomach. Of course, in those years, he had no coach and no uniform. He was just a lonely kid, waiting his turn at the edge of the court, in a sweaty t-shirt and worn-out basketball shoes. But the fire was always there in his eyes. One day, while he was practicing alone in front of the old school hoop, an old man approached him. He had a bag with a few basketballs in it. He was simply dressed and quiet. He asked Jimmy only one thing: "Why are you here so early every day?" Jimmy's voice sounded very tired when he answered, but it was just as clear: "Because this is my only way out, sir." The man came every morning after that day. His name was Coach Leonard. He was a retired physical education teacher. He never treated him like a star. Discipline, sweat, repetition, and silence. He was Jimmy's first real coach. Everyone who knew him knew that Coach Leonard only spent time with kids who worked hard and were determined. Years later, when he won a scholarship to Marquette University, Jimmy packed his suitcase in an old bag given to him by Coach Leonard. It still had the worn logo of Liberty Heights Middle School on it. Jimmy had never thrown it away, because it always reminded him of where he came from and what he was fighting for. Now, sitting across from Michael Jordan in the NBA headquarters, in a room filled with legends, he could feel the weight of that old bag on his shoulders again. But this time, it wasn't filled with regret, but with determination. The air in the conference room was still heavy, but of course, it wasn't just the weight of Jordan's words. There was also the weight of Jimmy's silent, confident stance. It was another player's turn to speak, but no one was paying attention. All eyes were still on Jimmy. He wasn't even looking at the notes in front of him. In fact, he was preoccupied with the notes in his mind. Real numbers, real stories, real lives. At that moment, Marcus was all he could think about. Marcus was a 13-year-old boy he had met at a youth camp in Miami last summer. His mother worked 3 jobs, and his father was absent. Marcus's biggest dream was to play for a professional team one day. But there wasn't even a gym in his neighborhood. The kids practiced in an abandoned parking lot with broken hoops. When Jimmy visited, Marcus asked him, "You came from behind, just like us, right?" Jimmy nodded and simply replied, "That's right, son." Marcus's words still echoed in his ears, because the responsibility of being the voice of Marcus and thousands like him was waiting for him in that room. Cameras, microphones, and social media were all beside him. That day, Jimmy felt compelled to prove something not only to Jordan, but also to Marcus, Coach Leonard, and the abandoned hoops in Liberty Heights. The meeting progressed, but Jimmy was no longer just a participant. He was the one who changed the atmosphere in the room, and this was finally the beginning. As time passed, NBA executives began whispering among themselves. Some former stars nodded their heads, repeating Jimmy's words over and over again. Jordan had been silent for a while, but his silence was not due to indifference. He was trying to evaluate the situation. After the meeting, an executive approached Jimmy quietly in the hallway. His name was Ellis. He was the youth program coordinator. He was holding several files in his hand. Adjusting his glasses, he spoke quietly. "I think your speech should be taken seriously. Maybe we need to review a few formulas." Jimmy nodded. "My only concern is to support the kids who take this seriously. I'm here today, but tomorrow there should be a Marcus in my place. Those kids should never have to walk through 5 neighborhoods for a basketball hoop." Ellis handed the file to Jimmy. "You can use this data in the next session. We can work together if you want." Jimmy looked him in the eyes without taking the file. "I'm already where I need to be for this job. But more importantly, if you're ready to really listen to these kids, we can work together." There was a moment of silence between them, but this time, it was a silence of sincerity. As the meeting was about to adjourn, Jimmy was still standing. Some executives went up to congratulate him. Others passed by silently. But as he left the room, Jordan's eyes were, of course, on Jimmy again, just for a second. But Jimmy knew now. It wasn't going to be easy to ignore him after all. Less than 2 hours after the meeting, A video clip of Jimmy Butler's words began circulating on the NBA's internal communication channels. It was short, clear, and impressive. "I belong on this court, because the kids who brought me here are still there." These words didn't just echo in that meeting room. In fact, they had already appeared on thousands of cell phone screens. First, sports commentators shared them, then former players, then young people, and kids like Marcus. Social media was suddenly ablaze. Hashtags such as #Butler belongs, #the court is his, and speak for the streets started trending. Jimmy's calm, unemotional but determined tone left a much deeper impression than those who were shouting. An hour later, ESPN's homepage featured an analysis titled, "Jimmy Butler's Response Shakes NBA Arenas." TNT Sports replayed the scene over and over again in its news bulletins. Some commentators claimed that Jimmy had crossed the line against Michael Jordan. However, many former players argued that he had courageously voiced a justified stance. Things moved much faster online. On TikTok, a high school student posted a video with Jimmy's words as subtitles, standing in front of an abandoned basketball hoop in Liberty Heights, saying, "This is where Jimmy came from. Our hoop is still broken, but we definitely don't feel alone anymore." The video reached 4 million views overnight. In Miami's northern neighborhoods, a local youth center wall was spray-painted with the words, "I belong here, because I'm still here." But Jimmy remained silent amid the viral wave. At the end of the day, he sat alone in his apartment in Miami. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't close the curtain. As he looked out the window, he had only one question on his mind. What happens next? Notifications kept popping up on his phone. His teammates, his manager, his former coaches. Some congratulated him. Some reminded him to be careful. Some were just scared, because standing up to legends in the NBA could cost you your career in the long run. But Jimmy was familiar with this situation. It wasn't the first time he had done this. When he was in college, he was benched at the beginning of the season for standing up to the team captain. It was simply because he didn't shy away from saying what was wrong. Jimmy never backed down then, because for him, it was never about the minutes. It was always about the kids he represented. At that moment, he remembered something Coach Leonard had said. "Some doors seem closed to you. If you don't open them, no one else will." That night, Jimmy turned off his phone and sent a single text message. It was to Marcus. "Bro, I was thinking about you during that meeting. This job is yours." The next morning, the manager of the gym in Liberty Heights called. Donations had already started pouring in for the renovation of the gym, where Jimmy played as a child. The $6,000 donation made in Jimmy's name the day after the meeting was enough to replace the old floorboards. But this was still just the beginning for him. 2 days later, the morning show Good Morning Sports invited Jimmy to appear on their live broadcast. The host greeted him with a smile. The studio was warm. The lights were bright. A large stage had been set up in front of the camera. But Jimmy didn't put on an act. He was just himself. At the beginning of the program, the host asked him directly, "When Michael Jordan told you that you didn't belong on that court, what was the first thing that crossed your mind?" Jimmy paused for a moment. Then, looking straight at the camera, as if responding to Jordan, he said, "I've been hearing that phrase since I was a kid. Sometimes it's said openly, sometimes it's implied, but every time, there's only one thing I know. If I'm sweating on a court, then I belong there." The host didn't seem very impressed, but Jimmy continued, "This isn't just about me. It's about kids like me. Kids who walked the streets I walked and were still left behind. Someone needs to stand up and say to them, 'I see you, and these arenas are yours too. This dream is yours, and you can do it.'" Before the program ended, messages from viewers began to scroll across the bottom of the screen. A teacher, "I showed this to my students today. They were all silent, with respect." A young basketball player, "Bro, I didn't dream because I didn't have a hoop, but now I'm going to try again." After the program, he approached Jimmy, the studio assistant. He was excited and young. He had a notebook in his hand. "Mr. Butler, I'm studying sports media. I just want to tell you something. What you said today touched me deeply for the first time in a long time." Jimmy nodded, looked at him, and said slowly, "Just tell the truth, son. Then you'll be remembered for a long time. That moment was short, but it was eternal. That evening, Jimmy's agent called him on the phone. There was a request for a meeting from the NBA management. Jordan would not be attending the meeting, but a new commission was being formed on early development programs. And Jimmy had been called there as a consultant. Just 3 days ago, the man who was told, "You don't belong on this court," was now being proposed as the first name for a new system to be established for children. But Jimmy was still cautious, because he knew all too well that people had pretended to listen to him before. If he wanted to make a difference this time, he couldn't just talk at meetings. He had to get out on the field, back to the schools, and even the gyms. And he would. The next morning, he was seen practicing passing with children on the cracked concrete playground of Liberty Heights Middle School. There was no media, no sponsors, just a ball, a few children, and a man who had come to leave his story with them. Jimmy Butler bent down on his knees and placed the ball in the hands of a small child. "Look," he said, "first bend your knees, then relax your wrist. This isn't just a pass, it's a TO for you." The child nodded, but the look in his eyes said, "Is this man really here?" Because for them, figures like this only existed on television, in the stands or in commercials, but never on the same field as them. But there was Jimmy, quietly, unpretentiously, and in that moment, he was doing something else. He was breaking down walls, not physical walls, but mental ones. There was an old woman standing at the edge of the field. She was the school janitor. She was leaning on a mop handle. Watching, Jimmy caught her eye. She just bowed her head. That nod was an acknowledgement that came from a long life. "Yes, you belong here, son," she said silently. In the days that followed, it was inevitable that this visit would leak to the media. But here's what was interesting. It wasn't the video recordings that spread, but what the children said. "He asked us what we needed. He listened," wrote one child on social media. Another said, "That day was the first time I smiled at school because someone came to spend time with me, not just to play." For Jimmy, these small moments were more real than large gatherings. But of course, the media did not remain silent. Within a week, 5 different programs wanted to interview him. CNN, Sports Illustrated, even talk show hosts. They all asked him the same thing. "How did you feel when you answered Michael Jordan?" Each time, Jimmy began with the same sentence. "That answer wasn't mine. That answer belonged to everyone who couldn't make their voices heard." But deep down, he was struggling with another pressure. Some NBA executives had begun to think he was too visible. During a meeting with his team, some members of the coaching staff warned him to stay focused. Some sponsors had quietly pulled out. This didn't surprise Jimmy, of course, because he knew the noise would pass, but the work would remain. That's why, when he attended the first meeting of the newly formed NBA Development and Opportunity Commission, he didn't just talk. He went there with a plan. He was carrying a folder. On the cover was written, "First step, not infrastructure, access." Inside were letters collected from children in Liberty Heights. Each one was handwritten. "I want to practice, but I don't have shoes. There's no basketball hoop in our neighborhood. We shoot into a trash can. I've always wanted to see an NBA player." The commission members were silent at first. Then the file was passed from hand to hand. A few people took off their glasses as they turned the pages. Finally, it was the young coordinator's turn to speak. "Mr. Butler, the pilot program you're proposing may be challenging in terms of budget, but its impact will be just as significant. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Jimmy replied without looking away. "I took on this burden when I was 13 years old. At that time, all I had was a backpack and my dreams. Today, I have all of Liberty Heights on my shoulders. So yes, I definitely want to." His words echoed throughout the room. The proposal was accepted, and the Butler Basketball Startup Program was launched in 5 low-income areas across the country. The project was not widely publicized in the media because it was not meant to be an advertising campaign. It was meant to be just that, a start. But Jimmy was still cautious. He knew that this would take patience and determination, not just for that day, but for years to come. That evening, he returned to Miami. Looking out the airplane window, his eyes wandered toward Liberty Heights amid the night lights. He took out his phone, opened his notes app, and wrote just one sentence. Fame can give you a microphone, but you choose the story. The next morning, a letter was waiting for him in his office. It was from an unfamiliar school in a small town up north. Inside the envelope was a childishly written card. "Mr. Jimmy, we watched you speak at our school today. Our teacher cried. I'm going to work harder now, because one day I want to play with you." There was a small drawing underneath. A child was wearing Jimmy's jersey and holding a basketball. Jimmy took the card and pinned it to the board next to his desk. Next to it was a note Coach Leonard had given him years ago. "Some voices are spoken softly, but they are heard the loudest." Now, many people could hear his voice, but what mattered to Jimmy was what that voice had left behind. Although the media's interest waned over time, Jimmy's words continued to linger in people's minds. Sports programs were now chasing new headlines, playoff statistics, transfer rumors, advertising campaigns. But there were still streets in Liberty Heights without basketball hoops. There were still children sharing a ball. There were even those who still waited with hope. Jimmy didn't forget. The pilot program that began after the commission's proposal was approved progressed slowly but steadily. Basketball courts were being renovated in cities such as Liberty Heights, Oakland, Baton Rouge, Cleveland, and Camden, and free training and equipment were being provided to young people in the neighborhoods. But Jimmy never held a press conference. He always stayed away from the limelight, because for him, it wasn't about being seen, it was about making the unseen visible. When one of the first gyms established under the program opened in Liberty Heights, there was no official opening ceremony. That morning, Jimmy arrived wearing a plain gray t-shirt and old sweatpants. He was carrying a bag with old jerseys, a few balls, and a notebook he had written in. On the first page of his notebook was written, "Remember, there will be many who try to silence you, but the only place you speak is on your own court." The children who entered the hall first were very surprised to see him. Some smiled. Some were embarrassed and didn't know what to do. Jimmy bent down and tapped one of the balls on the floor. "Anyone want to play?" he said simply. There was no media there that day, but moments that would be remembered in the future were experienced. After every shot a child made from the three-point line, he looked at Jimmy, seeking approval. Jimmy nodded every time and said, "Keep going," because those kids weren't just playing basketball, they were trying to prove themselves. That same week, some reactions began to emerge from within the NBA. Some commentators kept saying he was too social, too political, too serious. Even some within the team implied that they found his leadership on the court distracting. But Jimmy was used to it. There had always been those who found him too much over the years. Too tough, too quiet, too clear. Yet Jimmy was just being himself. After a game, a reporter cornered him in the locker room and asked, "Mr. Butler, as a star player, do you have to be so political? Isn't it enough to just stay on the court?" Jimmy paused. He untied his shoelaces and replied without looking up. "For me, the court isn't just the hardwood. Sometimes it's the classroom. Sometimes it's the bus stop. Sometimes it's in front of a broken wall. So yes, I'm on the court, and I'll always be on the court." These words made headlines the next day, but Jimmy didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the meaning. As the weeks went by, the Butler program continued to grow. What had started as a pilot project was now a model for the entire league. Some clubs contacted Jimmy's office to start similar programs in their own cities. Sponsors slowly began to return, but Jimmy was still the same, unassuming, clear, and determined. One day, when he was given the floor at the NBA Development Commission's year-end meeting, everyone wondered what he would say. The room wasn't very big, but it was filled with important people. Michael Jordan wasn't there this time, but of course his representative was in attendance. Jimmy stood up and began to speak without looking around. "Some of you know me for my answer, but I didn't give that answer for the first time that day. That answer came from years of silence, from the neighborhoods, from those who turned a deaf ear, from those who were ignored. Being in this room isn't just about talking. It's about listening. It's about changing. And most importantly, it's about staying." No one in the room moved. "I didn't leave that room that day," said Jimmy, "because real change starts when you stay in the room. At the end of the meeting, some members congratulated him, while others quietly walked away. But no one thought of him as just a player anymore. In the days that followed, a sign was hung at the entrance to the new hall in Liberty Heights. It read, "Jimmy Butler Sports and Hope Center. One more court for everyone." The opening ceremony was again simple, but that day, an elderly woman from Jimmy's childhood neighborhood placed her hand on his shoulder. "You're not just a player, you're a stayer, son," she said. Jimmy didn't respond. He had lowered his eyes, because some words never need an answer. That same evening, he wrote a new note in the little notebook he had written himself. "One day, if someone comes to you and says, you don't belong on this court, change that court for kids like you. That's when you'll belong on these courts." Jimmy Butler didn't leave the court. He stayed and spoke, and then he continued his eternal work. If one day someone tells you, you don't belong in this room, or even on this field, stay silent like Jimmy Butler did. Wait for the right time, and speak up. Because sometimes the strongest response is simply not to leave. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like it, leave a comment, and subscribe, because we will keep sharing stories that truly make a difference.